You can run, but you can't escape. The Haunted Mansion's final twist. Chapter 1. Whispers in the Walls. The Monroe family arrived at Hollowfield Manor just as the late afternoon sun dipped below the horizon, casting the vast estate in a soft, golden glow. The long, winding driveway was lined with tall, gnarled trees, their branches arching overhead like skeletal fingers. The mansion loomed at the end of the path, a dark silhouette against the fading light, its ivy-covered walls and imposing structure giving it an air of forgotten grandeur. To Ethan Monroe, the sprawling isolation of the place felt perfect. "This is it," Ethan said with a small smile as he turned off the engine. His voice carried a mix of excitement and relief. For months, he had struggled to find the spark for his next novel, and the city had grown too noisy, too cluttered with distractions. This manor, with its remoteness and quiet, seemed like the sanctuary he needed to rediscover his creativity. Clara, seated next to him in the passenger seat, gazed up at the house with a faraway look. The artist in her appreciated the haunting beauty of the place, though a part of her couldn't shake the unease that crawled beneath her skin as they got closer. Lucas, their 8-year-old son, was the first to speak. "It's really big," he said softly, his wide eyes fixed on the mansion's towering form. There was something about the house that made him feel small, almost as if it were watching them. He clutched his favorite action figure tightly, as if the toy's presence would keep him safe from the creeping dread he couldn't quite understand. "It'll be an adventure," Clara said, though her voice lacked conviction. She could feel the weight of the place, the heavy silence that seemed to press down on them the moment they arrived. The wind rustled through the trees, but inside the car, the air felt still, thick. They stepped out, and their footsteps echoed across the stone path leading to the front door. The house greeted them with an eerie quiet, as though it had been waiting. The creak of the heavy oak doors as they swung open sent a shiver down Clara's spine, and she glanced over at Ethan, who seemed blissfully unaware of the unsettling atmosphere. To him, the mansion was merely an opportunity. "Let's get inside," he said, motioning them to follow. He pushed the doors wide open, revealing the grand foyer. The interior was just as imposing as the outside, a vast hall with marble floors, sweeping staircases, and high vaulted ceilings. Dust lingered in the air, dancing in the fading sunlight that filtered through the large, arched windows. The house had a forgotten quality, as though it had been untouched for years, and yet everything seemed intact, preserved in a state of eerie stillness. Lucas stayed close to Clara as they entered. His small hand gripped hers tightly, and his gaze darted around nervously. There was something about the silence that unsettled him. It wasn't the kind of quiet he was used to. It felt alive. As they made their way down the hallway, he tugged at his mother's sleeve. "Mom, do you hear that?" he whispered. "Hear what, sweetie?" Clara asked absent-mindedly, still taking in the massive chandelier hanging above them. "The whispering?" Lucas replied, his voice barely audible. He glanced at the walls, his brows furrowing in confusion. Clara paused and listened, but all she heard was the soft rustling of their clothes as they moved and the faint sound of the wind outside. "It's just the house settling," she said gently, patting Lucas's head. "Old houses make a lot of noise." Lucas nodded, but the look in his eyes didn't change. He knew what he had heard, soft, hushed voices, like someone speaking just out of earshot. He clutched his toy tighter and stayed close to his mother's side as they explored the rest of the house. As the evening wore on and the family unpacked, the eerie whispers seemed to linger in the background, unnoticed by Ethan and Clara. The rooms were vast, cold, and filled with antique furniture that looked as though it hadn't been moved in decades. The mansion was almost too quiet, as if sound was swallowed up by its walls. Each step echoed, fading into nothingness. After dinner, the family settled into their new home. Clara worked on setting up her art supplies in the sunroom, where the light would be best during the day. Ethan retired to his study, a grand room lined with dusty old books, hoping that being surrounded by the remnants of forgotten stories would inspire him. But the blank page in front of him remained empty, the words refusing to come. It wasn't until late into the night, as the house fell into complete silence, that Ethan began to feel the weight of the place. He sat at his desk, staring at the page, the soft glow of his lamp, the only light in the room. The whispering started faintly, almost imperceptible at first, like a breeze passing through the house. He paused, his pen hovering above the paper, and listened. At first, he thought it was his mind playing tricks on him, perhaps the wind outside or the settling of the old wood. But the more he listened, the more distinct the sound became. It wasn't just noise, it was voices, whispering, faint but persistent. He couldn't make out what they were saying, but there was something unnerving about the way the sound seemed to come from all around him, as if the very walls were speaking. Ethan shook his head and rubbed his eyes, blaming fatigue for his imagination. It was late, and he was probably just tired from the move. He pushed the whispers from his mind and returned his focus to the empty page in front of him. But the moment his pen touched the paper, he heard it again. This time, it was clearer. Ethan. He froze. His heart pounded in his chest as the sound of his name drifted through the air, so soft he could have convinced himself it wasn't real. But there it was again, Ethan. He stood abruptly, knocking his chair back. His eyes darted around the room, but there was nothing, just the oppressive silence that followed the whisper. The lamp flickered slightly, casting strange shadows across the bookshelves. The air in the room felt colder, and he realized with a jolt that he was holding his breath. Trying to shake off the unease, Ethan left the study and headed upstairs. As he passed by Lucas's room, he saw the door slightly ajar. He pushed it open gently, not wanting to wake his son. But the sight that greeted him stopped him cold. Lucas was sitting on the floor, facing the wall, his small frame silhouetted by the dim nightlight. His lips moved silently, as if he were talking to someone. But there was no one there. Ethan stood frozen in the doorway, his heart pounding in his chest. "Lucas?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Lucas didn't turn around, he kept whispering. Ethan strained to hear, but the words were too soft, too faint. Then, as if sensing his father's presence, Lucas slowly turned his head. His eyes were wide, and his face was pale. For a moment, the room felt colder, the air heavy with something unspoken. "They're telling me things, Daddy," Lucas said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Ethan's blood ran cold. Chapter 2. Echoes of the Past. The days at Hollowfield Manor unfolded in a strange, unsettling rhythm. The quiet was almost too perfect, broken only by the occasional creak of the old wooden floors or the soft hum of wind against the window panes. Clara found herself growing more uneasy with each passing day. The house felt different, alive, somehow. There were moments when she swore she wasn't alone, even in empty rooms. It started with small things. One afternoon, as Clara painted in the sunroom, she reached for a brush on the table, only to find it had moved. Just an inch or two, barely noticeable, but enough to make her pause. She stared at the brush, unsure if it was her imagination playing tricks on her. But when it happened again the following day, this time a paint jar inexplicably shifted from one side of the table to the other. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Clara tried to dismiss it as absent-mindedness, chalking it up to stress from the move. But the more she tried to ignore it, the more persistent the oddities became. Rooms that were warm just moments ago would suddenly turn icy cold, the temperature dropping without warning. Her breath would fog up in the chilly air, and she would find herself shivering despite the sun shining outside. It didn't make sense. One evening, as the setting sun cast long shadows through the manor, Clara decided to check on Lucas. He had been unusually quiet since their arrival, spending long hours in his room with the door closed. She knocked gently before entering, but when she stepped inside, her heart skipped a beat. Lucas sat on the floor, surrounded by crumpled sheets of paper. Each page was covered in drawings, dark, twisted images that sent a chill down her spine. The figures in the drawings were grotesque, their faces twisted into expressions of torment, with hollow, empty eyes that stared back at her. In one of the pictures, a tall, shadowy figure stood over a smaller figure, its face obscured but its posture menacing. "Lucas, what are these?" Clara asked, her voice wavering as she knelt beside him. Lucas didn't look up. He kept drawing, his hand moving quickly across the page. "They're the people from the house," he said softly. Clara's heart raced. "What do you mean, sweetheart? What people?" Lucas finally met her gaze, his eyes wide and solemn. "The ones in the walls. They're trying to get out." Clara swallowed, her mouth dry. She glanced at the drawings again, her pulse quickening. "Lucas, there's no one in the walls. It's just an old house. Sometimes old houses make strange sounds." Lucas shook his head, his expression serious. "No, Mom. They're there. They talk to me. They don't like it when you say they're not real." A shiver ran down her spine. The room felt colder, the air heavier. Clara forced a smile, trying to hide her unease. "Why don't we take a break from drawing for a while, okay?" she suggested, gathering up the papers. Lucas didn't protest, but the look in his eyes stayed with her long after she left his room. That night, as she lay in bed next to Ethan, she couldn't sleep. Her mind kept returning to the drawings, to the hollow-eyed figures staring back at her. She didn't want to admit it, but something about the house was unsettling Lucas, and maybe, just maybe, it was unsettling her too. A few days later, the knock came. It was mid-afternoon, and Clara was in the kitchen when she heard it. 3 sharp raps at the front door. Startled, she wiped her hands on a towel and made her way to the entrance. She wasn't expecting anyone, and the isolation of the manor meant they rarely had visitors. Opening the door, she was greeted by an unexpected sight. Standing on the porch was an elderly woman, her face weathered by time and her eyes sharp with an intensity that made Clara's breath catch. The woman was small and frail-looking, but there was something about her that commanded attention. "I'm Mrs. Abernathy," the woman said without preamble, her voice firm despite her age. "Your neighbor. I live just down the road." Clara blinked in surprise. The nearest house was at least a mile away, and she hadn't expected to see anyone from the area, let alone someone who seemed to know the house. "Oh, hello," Clara said, a bit flustered. "It's nice to meet you. Would you like to come in?" Mrs. Abernathy's eyes flicked toward the doorframe, but she didn't step forward. "No, thank you, dear," she said briskly. "I won't stay long. I just came to give you a bit of advice." Clara raised an eyebrow. "Advice?" The old woman's gaze drifted toward the manor, her expression darkening. "You've moved into a house with a long memory. This place, it doesn't forget. It holds on to things, events, people. You do well to remember that." A chill crawled up Clara's spine. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Abernathy gave her a long, appraising look. "This house has seen more than its fair share of tragedy. It doesn't like change, you see. It remembers everything that's happened here, and it holds on to it." Clara felt her throat tighten. "What kind of tragedies?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. But Mrs. Abernathy only shook her head. "I've said too much already. Just be careful, especially with your boy. The house has a way of finding those who are sensitive." With that cryptic warning, Mrs. Abernathy turned and shuffled down the steps, leaving Clara standing in the doorway, a cold knot of fear tightening in her chest. She watched the old woman disappear down the long driveway, the weight of her words pressing down on her like a heavy blanket. As the days passed, Ethan became more withdrawn. He spent most of his time in his study, poring over old books and documents, barely speaking to Clara or Lucas. The whispers he had once dismissed now haunted him, their soft voices constantly beckoning him to listen. They seemed to call from the very walls, faint and persistent, urging him to pay attention. Ethan had tried to ignore them at first, but his curiosity had gotten the better of him. The whispers were more than just noise. They were words, fragments of a story he couldn't quite grasp. It was as if the house itself was trying to tell him something, to guide him toward a forgotten secret buried deep within its history. His frustration over the lack of progress on his novel had turned into an obsession with the house's past. He spent hours researching, combing through old newspapers and archives. He discovered that Hollowfield Manor had once belonged to the Carlyle family, a wealthy, prominent family in the early 1900s. But something had happened, a tragedy. The details were vague, shrouded in mystery, but there were whispers of a child who had gone missing and a mother who had gone mad. The more Ethan uncovered, the deeper his obsession grew. He was certain that the whispers were connected to the tragedy, that they were trying to reveal the truth of what had happened all those years ago. But the more he listened, the more the whispers seemed to turn on him. They grew louder, more insistent, until they became an unbearable cacophony in his mind. Clara noticed the change in him. He had become distant, irritable, snapping at her over the smallest things. She tried to talk to him about it, but he brushed her off, retreating to his study for hours on end. The house seemed to be pulling him deeper into its grasp, and Clara didn't know how to reach him. Then, one night, as she tucked Lucas into bed, he looked up at her with wide, solemn eyes. "The house doesn't like Daddy," Lucas whispered, his voice trembling slightly. Clara's heart lurched. "What do you mean, honey?" Lucas hesitated, then whispered, "It says he's asking too many questions. It wants him to stop." Clara's blood ran cold. Chapter 3. The Voice Inside. Ethan's sleep had become a battleground. Each night, as soon as his body surrendered to exhaustion, his mind was plunged into a labyrinth of distorted dreams. In them, the house was no longer a mere structure. It became a living entity, breathing and pulsing, its walls constricting around him like a coffin. He was trapped inside, unable to escape as the whispers surrounded him, louder now, intelligible, almost shouting, but never clear enough to grasp. In his nightmares, Ethan found himself wandering the narrow, winding corridors of Hollowfield Manor, the walls closing in, their surfaces rippling as if they were made of flesh. The whispers seemed to rise from deep within the foundation, echoing through the floorboards and seeping through the plaster. They would coil around him, urging him to listen, to follow, to obey. But follow what? Obey whom? Each time, the dream ended the same way, with Ethan standing before a sealed door hidden deep in the recesses of the house, a door he had never seen in waking life. The door would throb like a heartbeat, the whispers hissing from the other side, more frantic, more demanding. And every time, just as he reached for the handle, he would wake, drenched in sweat, his heart racing, the whispers fading into the silence of the night. After weeks of these dreams, the boundary between sleep and reality began to blur. Ethan found himself questioning what was real and what was imagined. During the day, he caught fleeting glimpses of movement out of the corner of his eye, shadows darting between rooms, dark figures vanishing into walls. The whispers, once confined to the night, began to plague him during the daylight hours. He would hear them faintly as he sat at his desk, urging him to dig deeper, to uncover the secrets buried within the house. The weight of the house pressed down on him. It was suffocating, an ever-present force that gnawed at his sanity. Ethan tried to confide in Clara, but the words wouldn't come. She had already noticed his growing distance, the long hours he spent locked in his study, the dark circles under his eyes from sleepless nights. He didn't want to burden her with his own unraveling thoughts. Instead, he threw himself into his research, convinced that the key to understanding the house lay within its past. Upstairs, Clara was dealing with her own unease. The house, which had once held the promise of a new beginning, now felt like a prison. Lucas's strange behavior was becoming harder to ignore, and the drawings continued to pile up, each more disturbing than the last. Clara couldn't shake the feeling that the house had sunk its claws into her son, that it was feeding on his innocence, twisting his imagination into something dark and unrecognizable. One morning, while Lucas was at school and Ethan holed up in his study, Clara decided to tackle the attic. The room had been left largely untouched since they moved in, filled with old furniture draped in dust-covered sheets and crates stacked haphazardly against the walls. Armed with a broom and determination, she began the arduous task of clearing the space. As she worked, something caught her eye. A small, weathered chest tucked into a corner, half buried beneath a pile of old blankets. It was unassuming, its wood splintered and its brass latch tarnished with age. Curiosity piqued. Clara knelt beside it, brushing away the dust before carefully prying it open. Inside, she found a bundle of yellowed papers, letters it seemed, and nestled beneath them, a worn leather journal. The cover was cracked and fragile, its edges frayed from years of neglect. Clara's fingers tingled as she lifted the journal, her breath catching in her throat. She flipped open the first page, her eyes scanning the elegant, looping script of the name written inside. Margaret Carlyle. Clara's pulse quickened. The Carlyle family, the name was familiar. She had heard Ethan mention it during one of his late-night rants about the house's history. They were the previous owners, but beyond that, she knew little. Turning the page, Clara began to read, the words drawing her deeper into the mind of the woman who had lived in Hollowfield Manor decades ago. Margaret's writing was fragmented, her thoughts scattered, her sentences often trailing off into incoherent ramblings. But one thing became clear as Clara read. Margaret had heard the whispers too. Margaret's journal spoke of sleepless nights spent pacing the halls, of voices that seemed to come from the walls, whispering her name, telling her things no one should know. She wrote of her growing conviction that the house was not just haunted, but alive. She believed it fed on the fears of its inhabitants, growing stronger with each soul it consumed. Clara's stomach twisted with unease as she read on. Margaret had written about her son, how he too had begun hearing the voices. At first they were faint, indistinct murmurs that the boy dismissed. But as time went on, the whispers grew louder, more commanding. Margaret became convinced that the house wanted her son, that it was trying to claim him for itself. Clara closed the journal, her hands trembling. The parallels were too close to ignore. Lucas had been hearing the same whispers, seeing the same dark figures. Was the house trying to claim him too? Meanwhile, Ethan's obsession had reached fever pitch. He had abandoned all pretense of working on his novel, instead poring over every scrap of information he could find about the house. The more he uncovered, the more convinced he became that the whispers were leading him toward something. A mystery, a secret that had been buried for years. The voices seemed to offer him clues, fragments of a story that he was determined to piece together. But the more Ethan listened, the more the whispers turned dark. They no longer offered tantalizing bits of information. They began to taunt him, mocking his efforts. They would grow louder in the silence of his study, hissing his name, filling his mind with doubt. He couldn't escape them, no matter how hard he tried. Clara grew increasingly worried about him. He was neglecting her, neglecting Lucas, shutting them out as he spiraled deeper into his obsession. She tried to reach out to him, but he had become a ghost of the man he once was. Distracted, hollow, lost in a maze of his own making. And then there was Lucas. His behavior had grown more erratic with each passing day. He would often sit in his room for hours, staring blankly at the wall, his lips moving as if he were having a conversation with someone Clara couldn't see. When she asked him about it, he would only shrug and say, "They're just telling me things." "What kind of things?" she asked, her voice tight with concern. Lucas looked at her with those solemn eyes that seemed far older than his 8 years. "Things about Daddy," he said softly. "They say he's asking too many questions. They don't like it." A chill ran through Clara's veins. "Who doesn't like it, Lucas?" Lucas hesitated, then whispered, "The house." Later that night, long after everyone had gone to bed, Ethan stumbled upon a final, devastating revelation. While sifting through Margaret's journal once more, he found an entry he hadn't noticed before. It was dated just a week before Margaret had disappeared from the public eye, leaving behind a trail of unanswered questions. The entry described how Margaret's young son, who had been hearing the whispers for months, had gone missing. He had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only his toys and an unfinished drawing. A drawing of a door hidden somewhere in the house, a door that led to the heart of its darkness. Ethan's blood ran cold as he read the final line of the journal. "The house told me it would take him, and now it tells me my time is coming too." That night, Lucas woke screaming, his face pale with terror. When Clara rushed into his room, he clung to her, trembling. Between gasping breaths, he whispered the words that would haunt her for days to come. "They said I'm next." Chapter 4. Shadows of the Forgotten. The tension inside Hollowfield Manor had reached a boiling point, an invisible pressure that squeezed the air tight, making it hard to breathe. Every room felt saturated with a creeping malevolence. It started slowly, barely perceptible shifts in the atmosphere. But now there was no denying that something was terribly wrong. Clara first noticed it in the living room one evening while cleaning up after dinner. She was stacking the plates when she heard a soft creak behind her. Turning around, she saw the old rocking chair, one they had found in the attic, swaying gently on its own. No one was near it. The chair's slow, deliberate motion felt like a silent taunt. Her heart raced as she backed away, her eyes locked on the chair until it came to a standstill. From that moment, the house's strange behavior escalated. The once subtle phenomena grew more overt, more aggressive. Heavy furniture, too large to move easily, would shift positions overnight. Drawers would be pulled open, their contents scattered across the floor. There were cold patches of air in the house. areas where the temperature would drop so suddenly that Clara's breath would mist, even though it was the height of summer. She would catch glimpses of dark shapes in her peripheral vision, slender figures darting out of sight the moment she tried to focus on them. At first, Clara thought it was just her imagination, her mind playing tricks in the low light. But the shadows persisted, always just beyond her line of sight, as if they were watching her, waiting. Worst of all was Lucas. He had grown disturbingly distant. The once lively boy who used to fill the house with laughter now spent hours staring blankly at the walls. He barely spoke to Clara anymore, and when he did, it was only in murmurs, half-formed sentences spoken as if he was talking to someone else, someone she couldn't see. One afternoon, Clara found him sitting in the hallway, his back against the wall, his eyes fixed on the empty space in front of him. He was whispering softly, his voice low and almost melodic. She knelt beside him, gently placing her hand on his shoulder. "Lucas, who are you talking to?" she asked, her voice shaking. He didn't answer at first, his lips still moving in that quiet, rhythmic murmur. Finally, without looking at her, he whispered, "They don't like it when you ask questions." Clara's skin prickled. "Who doesn't like it?" "The ones in the walls," he said, finally turning to meet her gaze. His eyes were wide, dark, and hollow. "They don't like it at all." Desperation gnawed at Clara's insides. She had to understand what was happening, had to know what force had seeped into their lives and why it seemed to be tearing her family apart. There was only one person she could turn to, Mrs. Abernathy, the elderly neighbor who had seemed to know more about the house than she was willing to share. The next morning, Clara found herself standing on Mrs. Abernathy's porch, her hands shaking as she rang the bell. The door creaked open, and Mrs. Abernathy stood before her, her small, wrinkled form casting a long shadow in the doorway. "You've come back," Mrs. Abernathy said, her voice thick with resignation. She didn't seem surprised to see Clara. "You've felt it, haven't you?" Clara nodded, her throat dry. "I need to know. What's happening to us? What is this place?" Mrs. Abernathy's expression darkened as she stepped aside, motioning for Clara to come in. Inside, the house was just as cluttered and dim as it had been during Clara's last visit, but now it felt suffocating, as though the weight of the secrets held within these walls was pressing down on her. Mrs. Abernathy settled into an armchair and folded her hands in her lap. For a long moment, she said nothing, staring at the fireplace as if lost in thought. Finally, she spoke, her voice low and grave. "Hollowfield Manor is not just an old house," she began. "It's much older than it looks, built on land that has always been tainted. Families have lived there over the centuries, and most of them have met terrible fates." Clara's breath caught. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Abernathy's gaze shifted to Clara, her eyes hard and unflinching. "The house feeds on the people who live in it. It takes what it wants, and once it sets its sights on someone, it doesn't let go. It draws you in, whispers in your ear, makes you believe you can uncover its secrets. But the house is the secret." Clara's hands clenched into fists. "So what happened to those families? Did they hear the whispers too?" Mrs. Abernathy nodded slowly. "Yes, they all heard the whispers, and every time it ended in tragedy. Some went mad, others vanished, and some were taken by the house itself." Clara felt a wave of nausea roll through her. "What do you mean? Taken?" "There are stories," Mrs. Abernathy said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Families that moved into the manor only to disappear, leaving no trace. Children that heard the voices just like your Lucas, and then one day they were gone. The house consumes them, piece by piece." Clara's heart pounded in her chest. "But why us? Why now?" Mrs. Abernathy shook her head. "The house chooses when it wants to. It's been dormant for years, but something woke it up again, and now that it's awake, it's hungry." Clara's mind raced. The thought of leaving crossed her mind, but even if they could escape, would the house let them go? Or had it already sunk its claws too deep into their lives? When Clara returned to Hollowfield Manor, the house seemed more oppressive than ever. The shadows felt closer, darker, and the whispers, though faint, seemed to hum beneath every surface. She walked through the front door, feeling as though she were crossing a threshold into something darker, something inescapable. Ethan, however, had succumbed entirely to the pull of the house. His behavior had grown erratic, paranoid. He spent hours locked away in his study, poring over old documents and scribbling incoherent notes about the house's history. His obsession had become all-consuming, driving a wedge between him and Clara. One evening, as Clara sat quietly in the living room, trying to think of a way to save her family, Ethan stormed in, his face pale and drawn, his eyes wild. "You've been talking to her, haven't you?" He spat, his voice laced with accusation. Clara frowned. "What are you talking about?" "Mrs. Abernathy," he snarled. "I know you've been seeing her behind my back. You're plotting something. You don't want me to solve this. You're afraid I'll find out the truth?" Clara stared at him, stunned. "Ethan, listen to yourself. This house is doing something to us. We need to leave." "Leave?" he scoffed. "You don't get it, do you? This is the most important discovery of my life. The whispers, they're trying to tell me something, to show me the truth. I'm so close, Clara. I can feel it." Clara's heart sank. She had lost him to the house. He was no longer her husband, but a man consumed by the same darkness that had claimed so many before him. Her thoughts turned to Lucas, and the terror of what might happen to her son overwhelmed her. She had to get him out. But how? Late that night, after hours of strained silence, Clara sat by Lucas's bed, watching him sleep. His breathing was shallow, his little face pale and expressionless. The house felt strangely calm, a heavy silence hanging in the air. Suddenly, Lucas stirred, his eyelids fluttering as though caught in a nightmare. He muttered something under his breath, so quiet that Clara almost missed it. Leaning closer, she caught the words that chilled her to the bone. "They're coming for Daddy." Chapter 5. The House Remembers. Ethan sat hunched over his desk, papers scattered around him in a chaotic mess. His eyes, bloodshot and wild, scanned the pages of Margaret's journal with feverish intensity. The room, dimly lit by a single lamp, felt oppressive, as though the walls themselves were watching, waiting. He flipped to the final entry, his heart pounding. The words scrawled across the yellowed paper were shaky, frantic, and filled with dread. "The house has taken him. I heard the walls closing in, and there was nothing I could do. My sweet boy is gone, swallowed by the darkness, and now it waits for more. It feeds on fear, thrives on suffering. There is no escaping it. It will take us all." Ethan's hands trembled as he traced the words with his fingers. The journal's finality struck him like a physical blow. Margaret had tried to warn them, tried to make them understand that the house wasn't just a place. It was a living, breathing entity, something far older and darker than they could ever comprehend. His gaze shifted to the far corner of the room, where the shadows seemed to pulse and writhe. The house was alive, and it had its sights set on Lucas. The thought made his stomach churn. He stood abruptly, pushing his chair back with such force that it slammed against the wall. "I won't let it take him," Ethan whispered, more to himself than anyone else. His mind raced. He had to communicate with the house, had to make it understand that Lucas wasn't part of whatever sick game it was playing. There had to be a way to reason with it, to bargain. The house had taken before, but this time things could be different. It had to be. The door to his study creaked open, and Clara stood in the doorway, her face drawn with exhaustion and fear. She had been watching him for days, seeing him sink deeper into his obsession, his paranoia, and now she couldn't take it anymore. "Ethan," she began softly, her voice cracking. "This is madness. We need to leave. Lucas isn't safe here. You aren't safe." He turned to face her, his eyes blazing with desperation. "No, you don't understand, Clara. I'm close. I can feel it. The house is trying to show me something. I know how to stop it." Clara's face twisted with disbelief. "Stop what, Ethan? The house is evil. It's tearing our family apart. You can't control it. You can't fix this." "I can," he insisted, his voice rising. "Margaret was close. She was right about the house, but she didn't go far enough. I found her last entry, Clara. The walls, they took her son, but I can stop it before it takes Lucas." Clara's patience snapped. She marched into the room, her voice shaking with anger. "Listen to yourself. You're talking like a madman. You're so consumed with this house, you can't even see what it's doing to us, to Lucas. He's terrified, Ethan. He's hearing things, seeing things, and all you care about is your damn research." Ethan flinched at her words, but he didn't back down. "You don't get it. The house is trying to communicate with me. It's not just some ghost story, Clara. There's something deeper happening here, something we can't see. But I can figure it out. I know I can. Clara shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. I don't care what you think you're going to find. I care about our son. He's slipping away, Ethan. He's not the same little boy anymore. And if we don't leave, I'm afraid we're going to lose him. Ethan's jaw clenched as the weight of her words sank in. For a fleeting moment, doubt flickered in his mind. But then the whispers came. Soft at first, like a gentle breeze rustling through the trees, but growing louder, more insistent. Stay. You're so close. We can show you everything. He turned away from Clara, his eyes unfocused, as if he were listening to something only he could hear. His breath quickened. You don't understand, he muttered, more to the voices than to Clara. They're telling me what to do. Clara stared at him, horror dawning on her face. Ethan, you're scaring me. You're scaring Lucas. We need to leave now. But Ethan was beyond reasoning. The house had sunk its claws into him, and he was too far gone to see the danger for what it was. He believed the whispers, believed that they held the answers he so desperately sought. I won't leave, he said firmly. Not yet, not until I finish what I've started. Clara took a step back, her hands trembling. If you won't leave, then I will. I'll take Lucas and we'll go. I won't let this house have him. The room fell into a tense silence, broken only by the faint hum of the whispers swirling around them. Ethan's eyes flicked to Clara, then to the door, as if weighing his options. But before he could respond, a voice, clear and cold, echoed through the room. They're coming for Daddy. Both Clara and Ethan froze. The voice hadn't come from either of them. It had come from the hallway, from Lucas. They rushed out of the study to find their son standing at the foot of the stairs. His eyes glazed over, his face pale and expressionless. He looked up at them, his small hands hanging limply by his sides. They said it's time, Lucas whispered, his voice eerily calm. The house wants Daddy now. Ethan's heart lurched in his chest. He reached out for Lucas, but the boy stepped back, his gaze vacant. No, Lucas, Clara gasped, rushing to her son's side and pulling him close. No one's taking Daddy. We're leaving right now. But even as she spoke, the air in the house shifted. The temperature dropped sharply, and the shadows that clung to the walls seemed to grow darker, thicker, as though they were slowly closing in. Ethan stumbled back, the weight of the house pressing in on him, suffocating him. The whispers swirled around him, louder now, almost deafening. You belong to us. We've waited for you. You've always been a part of this place. His knees buckled, and he sank to the floor, clutching his head. The faces of the dead, twisted, hollow-eyed and gaunt, began to form in the walls, their mouths moving in unison with the whispers. Stop! Ethan screamed, his voice breaking as he pressed his palms against his ears. But the whispers only grew louder, their words penetrating deep into his mind. Clara watched in horror as her husband crumbled under the weight of the house's influence, the man she once knew slipping further and further away. Suddenly, Ethan's eyes snapped open, wild and bloodshot, and he looked up at Clara and Lucas with a chilling realization. I've always been part of this house, he whispered, his voice hollow. I've always belonged here. And with that, the house seemed to breathe, a long, low creak reverberating through its bones as the walls pressed closer. The shadows swallowed the room whole, and the whispers fell silent. Chapter 6, The Final Whisper. Ethan stood in the center of the darkened room, surrounded by the faint echoes of whispers that seemed to rise from the very foundations of the house. The walls pulsed with a malevolent energy, as if the mansion itself were alive and breathing, watching him. He ran his fingers through his disheveled hair, feeling the weight of the house pressing down on him. Every creak, every flicker of shadow felt like it was a part of him now, woven into the fabric of his being. His hands trembled as he clutched the journal, its pages now worn from his constant, frantic study. Margaret's words echoed in his mind, mingling with the relentless whispers. The house had taken her son, just as it was trying to take Lucas. But deep down, Ethan knew the truth that he had refused to accept for so long. The house wasn't after Lucas. It was after him. All along, it had fed on his ambition, drawing him deeper into its grasp with the promise of answers, with the illusion that he could unlock its secrets and turn them into his next great masterpiece. The house had known exactly how to prey on him, how to manipulate his desires and push him to the edge of madness. It had whispered promises of greatness, of recognition, and he had foolishly believed every word. But now, standing in the suffocating darkness, he could see it for what it truly was: a trap. The house didn't want to be solved. It didn't want to be understood. It wanted him, his soul, his fear, his mind, and it had been slowly consuming him from the moment they stepped inside. Ethan sank to his knees, the weight of realization crushing him. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, filling the air with a cacophony of voices that all seemed to speak at once. They surrounded him, taunting him, drowning out his thoughts until he could barely remember who he was. "You belong to us now. You've always belonged to us." In the distance, the sound of hurried footsteps broke through the oppressive noise. Clara's voice rang out, desperate and trembling as she rushed into the room, her face pale with fear. "Ethan," she cried, her voice cracking as she reached for him. "Please, we have to leave. Lucas is terrified, and the house, it's not going to stop until it takes you. We need to get out before it's too late." Her words cut through the haze of whispers, pulling Ethan back to reality. If only for a moment. He looked up at her, his eyes hollow and haunted. Clara's hands gripped his arms, shaking him as if trying to snap him out of whatever trance the house had woven around him. "I can't," Ethan murmured, his voice barely a whisper. "It won't let me go. I'm part of it now." Clara's heart broke at the sight of him. This man who had once been so strong, so full of life, now reduced to a shell of his former self. Tears filled her eyes, but she fought them back, knowing that she had to stay strong for both Ethan and Lucas. "You're stronger than this," she insisted, her voice trembling with emotion. "The house is lying to you, Ethan. It's been lying all along. It's feeding off your fear, your obsession. But you're still you. We can leave, all of us. You just have to fight it." Ethan shook his head, his face etched with sorrow. "I've tried. God, I've tried, Clara. But the more I fight, the tighter its grip becomes. It's inside me now, twisting everything. I don't know where I end and the house begins." Clara knelt beside him, her hands cupping his face, forcing him to meet her eyes. "Ethan, listen to me. We can still save Lucas. We can still save you, but we have to leave now." For a moment, Ethan's resolve wavered. He could feel the love in Clara's touch, the warmth of her presence cutting through the cold that had wrapped itself around his soul. But then the voices returned, louder than ever, like a storm raging in his mind. "You can't leave. You belong here. You always have." Ethan clenched his fists, his body shaking with the force of the house's influence. He wanted to fight it, wanted it to break free, but the voices were too strong. Every time he thought he had control, the house would pull him back, deeper into its clutches. "I can't," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Clara, you need to go. Take Lucas and leave. I'm too far gone." Clara's eyes filled with horror. "No, I'm not leaving you behind. We're a family, Ethan. We stay together." Ethan's expression softened, and for the first time in days, there was a flicker of the man he used to be. "I love you," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "But the house, it's not going to let me leave. It wants me, Clara. I've given it too much. If you stay, it'll take all of us." Clara shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "We'll find a way. We'll fight it together." But deep down, she knew he was right. The house had its claws in him, and there was no pulling him back. She could see it in his eyes, in the way his body trembled with the effort to resist the voices. "Please," Ethan whispered, his voice cracking. "Go, take Lucas and go. I'll hold it back as long as I can." Clara hesitated, her heart breaking. She didn't want to leave him, couldn't imagine a life without him. But when she thought of Lucas, their innocent, terrified son, she knew she had no choice. "I'll come back for you," she promised, her voice choked with tears. "I swear I'll come back." Ethan gave her a sad smile. "Just keep him safe. That's all that matters now." With a final heart-wrenching look, Clara stood, her body trembling with the weight of the decision. She turned and rushed out of the room, her footsteps echoing through the house as she ran to Lucas, who stood waiting near the door, wide-eyed and frightened. She scooped him up in her arms, pressing him tightly to her chest as she bolted out of the front door and into the cold night air. The wind howled around them, and the house loomed behind them, dark and menacing. Clara fumbled with the car keys, her hands shaking as she placed Lucas in the back seat and slid into the driver's seat. She didn't dare look back at the house as she started the engine, her breath coming in ragged gasps. As they sped down the long, winding road, Clara could feel her heart pounding in her chest. She had done it. She had saved Lucas. But as they neared the edge of the property, something strange happened. A soft, barely audible whisper echoed through the car, like a distant voice carried on the wind. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. "You can't escape. We're always with you." Clara's blood ran cold as she tightened her grip on the steering wheel, her mind racing. She glanced at Lucas in the rearview mirror, his small face pale and wide-eyed, but he hadn't seemed to hear it. Her breath hitched as the realization hit her like a tidal wave. The house wasn't just a place. It wasn't confined by walls and doors. It had followed them. And no matter how far they ran, it would always be there, lurking in the shadows, waiting. The final whisper echoed in her mind as the car disappeared into the night, leaving the dark silhouette of the mansion far behind. But the house, its memory, wasn't done with them yet.